So Nick, should we start at 6:05?
Get the ball rolling.
Okay, let's get the ball rolling. Okay, so obviously I know a lot of people here and a lot of people here know me. Hi, everyone who doesn't know me. Welcome to Concordia virtually. My name is Charles Reese and I'm a linguistics professor and I'm the director of our new Center for Cognitive Science, which was founded about a year ago, right before quarantine. But Concordia has managed to keep going during quarantine. And we're fortunate to co-sponsor this event in honor of Black History Month with the new Black Perspectives Office. And so our other sponsors are the INDIE program, which is, it houses individually designed graduate programs, typically interdisciplinary graduate programs, and the linguistics program, which I'm also a part of, and also the Linguistic Students Association. We have a very active, dynamic students association. So my co-organizers, Annick Mougil-Flavien, the founding coordinator of the Black Perspectives Office, and she's going to tell us a little bit about this, this office, and then I'm going to come back and introduce our guest of honor. Okay, so Annick.
Thank you so much for that intro, Charles. It is such a pleasure to be here with you all. First of all, bonsoir tout le monde. I am so thrilled to be co-sponsoring this event. The Black Perspectives Office is a new office we launched in September of 2020. And we had originally started as a smaller project called the Black Perspectives Initiative. We center the voices of the Black community at Concordia. We champion Black perspectives. We offer services to our students, whether that be mentorship, scholarships, research funding, project funding, as well as, of course, advocacy support, and the same for our Black faculty and staff members. And then we get to do these fun events, which is something that I'm really, I love to be able to participate in the dissemination of Black methodologies, Black practices, and I just really wanted to read us in this moment to start, before we kind of begin to kind of root this also in the space that we're in at Concordia. I'm going to begin by acknowledging that Concordia's university is located on unceded indigenous lands. The Ganya-Gaga Nation is recognized as the custodians of the lands and waters on which we gather today. Jotjage, Montreal is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations. Today, it is a home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. We respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples within Montreal community. For myself, rooting ourselves in land is also extremely important for me on a ancestral level. So on both sides of my family, they were land workers, and that is the heritage that I come from. And one of the ways that we greet each other in Haiti, in terms of being able to acknowledge our relationships, but also the space that we occupy together, is that we say honneur, and then the person responds respect. So I would love for all of you who are able to unmute yourselves when I say honneur, to unmute yourself and say respect as we begin this wonderful journey with Dr. Michel DeGraff. So honneur.
Respect.
Merci. I'll let Charles present Michel.
Okay, thank you, Annick. Okay, so our speaker will just some details, some technical details. Our speaker is going to present for about 75 minutes, and then Annick will moderate the question period. And just in the meantime, Hisako Noguchi is the enforcer moderating the chat. So there's somebody keeping an eye on things, and we'll tell you how the question period is going to work later. Okay, so Michel DeGraff is a professor of linguistics at MIT, that's the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and he's the founder and director of the MIT-Haiti Initiative. I've put a link at the top of the chat, which promotes active learning and the Creole language in STEM disciplines, so science, technology, engineering, and math, in order to help Haitians learn in the language that most of them speak at home. So we're going to hear a lot about this project tonight from Michel. Michel received his PhD from the University of Pennsylvania in computer science and theoretical linguistics. And I think it's Michel's status as both a cognitive scientist who understands the complexities of the human language faculty as a mental computational system, combined with the fact that he's a native speaker of Haitian Creole, that make his activism and research on the social and historical and pedagogical and political issues surrounding language policy and race so valuable. So I imagine that many of you were surprised to hear about an event co-sponsored by the CogSci Center and the Black Perspectives Office. And I think, I know that one of the take-home messages are going to be that good science can contribute to a good society. So Michel personifies this lesson, and Nick and I are very grateful to him for making it possible for Concordia to celebrate Black History Month with this lecture. So welcome, Michel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Charles, Annick, and Carol Rose for this invitation. I'm very pleased to be giving this talk in connection with both CogSci and the Black Perspectives. And my talk is really very straightforward. It really, as you say, Charles, it connects CogSci with social justice and larger historical issues. And I'm even more pleased that I'm giving this talk in the context of Black History Month. And it's based on a very simple proposition. Maybe it's so simple that many of us, very fancy scientists and linguists and human rights workers, tend to forget this simple proposition, which is that language rights are at the core of human rights. Because, and here I adopt a phrase from Professor Eckhard Wolff, who said, language is not everything, but without language, everything is nothing. So if we assume that language is indeed central to everything, then it has to be central to human rights as well. So therefore, Black Lives Matter entails that our languages as Black people do matter as well. But this simple entailment brings up really vexing questions in the realm of linguistics, education, and world history. And these questions become even more vexing in the context of Haiti, especially if we think of the role that Haiti certainly plays or should play during Black History Month, if indeed we knew about our history. Because this is the country where I come from, Haiti. This is where, in the Americas, the Black Lives Matter movement did start in the 18th century already, long before there was a Black Lives Matter hashtag. So what you see here is a statue in the town of Vertières, in the north of the country, near the second largest town called Cap-Haïtien. And this is the town where my ancestors, mostly Africans, that's where they defeated an army sent by Napoleon to re-establish slavery on the island. And what's surprising is that history is so little known. So when we talk about revolutions in world history, if you go to Europe, even in France, actually, even in France, you ask about revolutions, they'll tell you about the US revolution, they'll tell you about the French one, liberté, égalité, fraternité, they'll tell you about the US where everyone has a right to pursue happiness. But they won't tell you that at the time when the French were claiming universal, in quotes, values of liberty, equality, fraternity, they were profiting from slavery. The same for the US. So in the context of Haiti, then, these questions about human rights become even more vexing, especially if we look at 1804, which is when Haiti became independent, right? And this document that you see here is one where, in fact, I like to think of this as Wakanda before there was Wakanda. Because in January 14th, after the Haitians became free and created a sovereign country where slavery was abolished, Dessalines wrote this letter inviting all Black people to come to Haiti to enjoy freedom. You see, and he even offered to pay slavers $40, which back then was much more substantial than it is today, to captains of ships that could return Africans to Haiti for the freedom. So that was Wakanda. If you remember Black Panther movie, that's the end of the movie where indeed Black Panther is going to try to help other Black people around the world to gain freedom. Okay, so that's the history of Haiti. But often what we know of Haiti, thanks to the media, is, as you know, there is an infamous president who referred to Haiti and to other African countries with the S word, a word that obviously would be more appropriate to describe his own mind than to describe a country. But people forget that if Haiti is not a poor country, Haiti has been impoverished. And if you dig a little bit into history, you'll see that this process of impoverishment started at the onset of our history in 1825 already. So my colleague, Professor Marlendo, wrote this article about how France committed probably was the largest heist in world history by having my ancestors pay what is worth now more than $20 billion as an indemnity for their independence. And that amount actually included the value of the lives of the enslaved Africans. So, but we don't know that often about the history of Haiti, what it meant for freedom, universal freedom, but also the cost that we have to pay for that freedom that we're still paying today. So, but now let's go back to Haiti's forgotten history in the context of language rights and human rights. So in effect then, what Haiti did back in 1804 is to give the proof of concept of universal human rights long before December 10, 1948, which is what's today celebrated as Human Rights Day, according to the United Nations. Now, what's troublesome is that much work in linguistics and much work in human rights organizations, including the UN, United Nations, especially its branches in the Global South. So basically those organizations in the statements, they include phrases like linguistic and cultural diversity, protection of citizens, education, justice, knowledge, liberty, and so on. And what I want to call your attention to is that the organizations are guilty of human rights violation on a daily basis in the Global South, in spite of these beautiful mission statements. And in spite of the work that they do actually elsewhere, producing resources for enhancing human rights. So that's a puzzle that we have to try to understand what to do about as linguists and as educators. So, and here I'm going to call now on linguistics, because there's one way in which linguistics itself, alongside education and human rights organizations, have in effect induced violations of human rights, even as we produce knowledge and resources about these communities whose rights we're violating. And typically those are Black and brown communities in the Global South. And what we do in effect, we turn them into the savage other. I'm using a phrase from my colleague anthropologist, Michel. So these savage others in the Global South, and sometimes the Global South includes pockets of the US and Canada. So Anik mentioned the First Nations. So the First Nations rights in many ways have been trampled, including by linguists and human rights organizations. And the goal is to basically silence us. So that's what we have to examine with a very critical eye. So in my own work in Haiti as an educator, as a Creole speaker, and as a linguist, so one thing which I've been wrestling with in terms of my own life is the ways in which various sorts of teaching, both implicit and explicit, from the very beginning of a child's life, including my own life, have made us feel like the other, the savage, the abnormal, the deficit in the classroom, at university, and often in our own countries, in our own schools. So Toni Morrison's first novel, The Bluest Eye, can help us understand in a visceral way the impact of this kind of systemic racism against our Black lives. So The Bluest Eye is a story pretty much a la Frantz Fanon of how racism can lead to self-hatred. As in the story of the main protagonist, Pecola Breedlove. And Pecola is a Black girl who wants blue eyes because she believes that having blue eyes will make her happy. So why does she believe that? And so Morrison's analysis is very straightforward. Is because from the moment she's born, all she sees around her are symbols of hegemony that makes her believe that being Black is ugly. And from my perspective, linguistic prejudice is one manifestation of what Morrison called the bluest eye. So in Haiti, where most Haitians are Black, children still suffer from structural racial violence. So for example, this photo is from a school in Haiti, in Lagonave, and the next one is from my own kindergarten years, which I'll come back to later. So both these photos are examples of the sort of symbolic violence that leads to the bluest eye syndrome. And in Haiti, it's widespread prejudice against our phenotype, against our native and national language, Creole, that make too many Haitian children feel like picola in wanting to be what they are not. So in this case, in the case of Haiti, it's not bluest eye per se, like in the story of Picola of Morrison, but it's linguistic bluest eye that works the most efficiently as one among many factors that create alienation. So one of my main points in this talk is that in Haiti, like in many other post-colonial communities, including Canada and the US, children are far too often made to desire a prestige language, often the language of former or present colonial powers, because the native languages are brutally devalued. And the point is that this systemic devaluation is implemented even by linguists, even by educators, even by human rights organizations, even those whose explicit mission is to promote, quote, linguistic diversity for, quote, the respect of human rights. And here I'm going to take as my poster case the UN, and especially its branch, UNESCO in Haiti. So the case of UNESCO's fostering bluest eye syndrome is all the more overwhelming as soon as we start to look at the very mission of UNESCO, which is at the antipodes of global racism, right? Because UNESCO, like many human rights organizations operating in the global south, is supposed to promote, this is part of the mission that you see on this slide here, access, knowledge sharing, freedom of expression, free flow of ideas, equal dignity, cultural diversity. So all of these terms are taken straight from UNESCO's mission statement. And what you'll see is that UNESCO, like many other organizations that are supposed to promote these sort of values, they violate them on a daily basis. And we have to understand, why can they do that? Where does that come from? And eventually, what I would like to get from you in the audience is, how can we do better? How can we push back? As linguists, as educators, do we have intellectual capital to push back on this kind of systemic racism on the part of organizations like UNESCO? And we could go look at beyond UNESCO, right? And look at how they operate. I'm going to pick UNESCO because in Haiti, they give perhaps the clearest case of systematic violations of human rights, even as they preach human rights, okay? So one of my main concerns in this lecture, and I think that I call it successful, if together, when it comes to language and human rights, if we can find ways to keep ourselves accountable, and how we can make organizations like our universities, our Ministry of Education, UNESCO, the World Bank, etc. How do we keep them accountable in the global south and beyond? Now, so from a linguistic perspective, the overarching goal is for us to understand together that indeed language rights are central to human rights. So how do we go about decolonizing or normalizing these languages, or these language varieties that have for far too long been stigmatized and excluded in linguistics, education, and in centers of power where knowledge is created and transmitted. Okay, so that's the big goal. Okay, so maybe in the Q&A period, you in the audience, you can come and basically make suggestions as to what concrete action steps we can commit to as individuals or as group of linguists in order to really make our languages deeply matter, not just in our problem sets, not just in our dissertations, not just in our teaching, but really how to make languages matter, all languages matter on a daily basis in the lives of these communities that we study. Okay, so that's the eventual ambitious goal. So this is the plan for the talk. So I'm going to start to give you my own perspective, which is a very personal one, because in this case, the personal is political. So I'll give you my autobiography as a linguist, as a Haitian, as an educator. And then in part two, I'll move from personal history to some key aspects of the intellectual history of linguistics and a bit about education as well, as they relate to the well-being, or really the unwell-being, of Black and Brown people in post-colonies worldwide, including First Nations in Canada. And then in part 3, I go to one example that I know best, which is the MIT-Haiti Initiative, which I take as an example of direct action by linguists and educators and other allies, scientists, engineers, toward direct action to help this global Black Lives Matter movement in concrete ways around language and education. So, okay, so this is the personal. So this is, I love that picture because it brings me back to my innocent childhood. For me, this is a really personal issue. It's not just academic, it's really personal. And also it will tell you from the get-go, my own biases, my own positioning in this argument, because I don't believe that science can be neutral, blah blah blah. So I'm telling you up front. So this is my biography, and that's how I've gotten to where I am in my analysis of both Creole languages, but also how linguists have looked at Creole languages like my native language, Haitian Creole. Okay, because for me, this whole process is also a matter of personal liberation, because I'm still working on all these Fanonian shackles that I grew up with as a child in Haiti. So the photo on the right is First Communion. I grew up in a very Catholic family where my parents had very clear ideas of what it meant to be a good child. So my parents loved me, I loved them, but they were part of society. And they too brought to bear this Manichaean connection, Manichaean in the sense of Frantz Fanon, between Christianity and presumed goodness. And there was this presupposed link between, and that could be a different topic for different talk, between African religions like Voodoo and what's supposed to be evil. So I grew up with this belief that Europe, Christianity is good, Africa, Voodoo and other African-derived rituals and belief systems and dances are supposed to be on the wrong side, very binary. Anyhow, in my childhood in Haiti, being a good child meant going to a Catholic school. The name of the school is Philippe Gonzague, which is one of the best schools in the country, where I was given a very colonial education, which I am still recovering from. And for example, this is a daily report card. So not daily, weekly report card. So I would get this report card every week. And as you can see, the top is the name of the school. Très bien means very well. This is classe de 10e, which is third year of primary school, third grade, basically. And the interesting part is the bottom photo with the school's regulation. So rule 1 is about absences. Rule 2 is a ban on weapons like knives. Rule 3 is a ban on loitering. And rule 4 is a ban on the use of Haitian Creole, which I call Creole in this talk, as it is called in Haiti. So now, what's striking is that about rule 4 is that Creole is our one single national language, spoken by everyone in Haiti, while French, which is still the primary language of instruction, is spoken fluently by most 5%. If you take fluent to mean that you can give jokes, you can play soccer, you can make love in Creole, then only probably no more than 3% is really fluent in Creole. Yet the school forbids the use of Creole. Not only it forbids it, but the textbooks also promote these notions that Creole is a bastard language. So the school, the textbooks themselves colonize Haitians. And it was just not when I was growing up. Today still, if you look at Haitian textbooks, they colonize Haitians into believing that the culture, the language are inferior. So this is a sample, right? So in this sample, so the first passage that's highlighted tells us that Creole is ridiculous and can be of no use to Haiti. The second highlighted passage tells us that Creole will never be anything but an inferior variety of French, right? So this is what we're being told, we're being taught. And the third passage asks parents that they never speak Creole to the children and that they show no mercy in correcting the children's Creolisms. That is, any influence of Creole on the French should be banned. Now, as linguists, you know that if your parents, if your community speaks only Creole, how will you ever be able to speak a French variety that's devoid of any influence of your native language? So basically, the textbook is asking the parents to never speak to the children. And that's the kind of families and schools that I grew up with, except that my parents could speak French to various degrees. Now, I need to stress again that the stigma is on the language, but I want to connect that to more general patterns of racial discrimination. And the language issue in Haiti is only one reflex of racialized injustice, okay? So again, we go back to Toni Morrison. And what you can see is that on this picture, going back to my kindergarten years, what I grew up with are these images of white children speaking French as the standards of racial beauty and linguistic excellence. So in Haiti, what you see is that this Gross Eye syndrome, both in its racial and linguistic dimension, affect an entire nation. From a tender age, children are being affected by most institutions, including the schools, including human rights organizations like UNESCO, that themselves too, they promote French as the gold standard of excellence. We'll see more of that in the second part of the talk. Okay, now another major problem is that most of our teachers and parents, they seem totally unaware of these problems. When I was growing up in Haiti, when I was a kid there, my parents never brought this up. I myself was really unaware that I was being colonized. And in fact, this is the working of hegemony. So hegemony works best exactly because those who perpetrate it are not even aware of how it functions and of its consequences, right? So the plea then is how to basically make all of these patterns overt and to call attention to them, especially among those in power, like those at UNESCO, those at the Ministry of Education. And it's a tough job. You have to keep telling them on a daily basis that, look, this is wrong. And this talk is part of this process. So now, to make a long story short, in terms of my own liberation, in my own case, I was lucky enough to leave Haiti to discover all the ways that I've been mentally colonized. Actually, now, when I go back to Haiti, people say, well, you're not really in Haiti. You're a diaspora, you're abroad. How can you understand how Haiti functions? Well, in my case, in a way, I'm lucky that I was able to leave Haiti and then to take another look at my country from a different perspective to understand the ways in which I was being enslaved mentally. So in fact, leaving Haiti, becoming a diaspora Haitian, helped me find liberation. And to give you, some of the facts of my own liberation, my epiphany took place in the 80s. And I was lucky, I did an internship at Bell Labs, which is now defunct, as a computer scientist. And I was working with linguists and researchers doing work in AI, working on the first instantiations of Siri, Alexa, basically working on programs that could process text into speech and vice versa. And that's when, as I was writing programs for speech processing by computers, as I was thinking of the rules that I was implementing, I realized that I could apply the same algorithms to Creole. And then I started asking myself, but I was told for my entire childhood, until I was 18, that Creole is broken French, that Creole is a broken language. And then I said, but then if I can apply to Creole what I can apply to French and to English and to Spanish, then it's not broken, it has rules. And that's how I became interested in linguistics. So my entry in linguistics was through the back door, through computation. Now we're in part 2 of the talk. And I'm going to shift now from personal history to the intellectual history of white supremacy in linguistics and education. In other words, what we're going to ask now is, how have language, education, and even, quote unquote, human rights work, have they been weaponized to create arbitrary grades of humanity? So grades of humanity is the phrase from Frederick Douglass. And also, actually, interestingly, it's also been used by the founder of the comparative method and the family tree model, August Fleischer, grades of humanity. So how can linguistics and education and human rights, 3 concepts that are supposed to elevate humanity, how have they been weaponized to actually create grades of humanity that in turn keep racialized and minoritized groups at the bottom of various hierarchies of wealth and power? So what we're going to see now is a series of anti-Creole and actually really anti-Black beliefs, claims, and practices by linguists, educators, by the leadership of Haiti's education system. and also claims and beliefs by human rights organizations like UNESCO in Haiti. So in my analysis, these quotes, I think, amount to the most explicit program of anti-Black colonial linguistics in education. Because it's so pervasive, and that people who are committing these violations of human rights, when you call them, when you say, look at what you're doing, look at the way you're treating Haiti's national language, it's like if they have no clue what you're telling them. It's like they cannot comprehend that as a human rights worker, as a fancy UNESCO UN employee, how can you be telling me that I'm violating my compatriots' human rights? It's to show you the degree to which the hegemony has been embedded in the fabric of society in Haiti. So I think Haiti gives us this amazing laboratory to understand the way hegemony works and can be so powerful. So, and that's what we need to crack. So again, I'm really humbly asking you to think about these issues, and if you have any advice, to bring them along. Because the nut is still not cracked. We're still trying to crack it. So let's start with Creole studies. And what you're going to see here is a small sampling of what I've called Creole Exceptionalism. And these are mostly quotes from research articles that I've made into the popular press. And the point is that linguistics, especially Creole studies, has participated in anti-Black colonial campaigns against Creole speakers from the very beginning of Creole studies. We started as part of the colonial enterprise, or what the European called the mission civilisatrice in Africa and the Americas. So the quote in one is perhaps the most spectacular. What is meant here is that, in effect, when I myself switch from speaking English to speaking Creole, then I automatically become a fossil of humanity. So if I were to say now in Creole, mes amis, est-ce que nous entendons des paroles racistes? It's as if my brain would revert back to an earlier stage of human evolution. So that's a spectacular claim. And really, with little basis in reality, if we accept the very simple position that I myself, Michel DeGraff, I belong to modern Homo sapiens. And my brain cannot be at once modern when I speak English and ancient and primitive when I speak Creole. So the claim really is incoherent, but yet it's a claim that's quoted by cognitive scientists, by people looking at the evolution of language, etc. And this claim has been quoted so widely that you even find it in the New York Times, courtesy of Creolist John McWhorter, that Creole languages are the only languages that have started again. Now, this is, again, quite spectacular, but this is basically a copycat claim going back to Bickerton's view about Creole studies as the Galapagos for linguists. Now, in quote 3, Creole is called broken French, and that's from Reuters. And quote 4, Creole is called a guttural French patois. So all these claims, I've looked at them and I've demystified them in my papers, which you can find on my MIT website. Now, what I want to look a bit more closely are claims about Creole languages that have a direct impact on the actual lives of Creole speakers. Because these claims, in effect, have the potential to block access to education for Creole speakers. So French linguist Albert Volman once claimed that Creole languages become endangered when they are used in the classroom. And the idea is straightforward, according to Volman, is that Creoles will decreolize, that is, they will undergo language death because of their very nature. And the metaphor here is very based, it's a very economic-based metaphor, which is that the language have so little apparatus to express complex concepts that when they are being used in education or for research, then what they have to do, they have to borrow. They have to, so think of the notion of borrowing from the IMF, for example. So they have to borrow so much from European languages that as a consequence of these borrowings, they will dissolve in those major languages. Now, this is a serious concern because if this claim were true, then it would mean that my own efforts at MIT to promote STEM teaching and other kinds of teaching in Creole, this could mean that I myself am engaged in killing my own language. Because it would mean that as Haitian Creole is being used in the classroom through MIT-Haiti, I'm causing the death of Haitian Creole that will eventually decreolize because of its inherent poverty. So I think that this is colonial linguistics to an extreme degree, basically forcing Creole languages outside of the classroom because of the alleged structural poverty. But sadly enough, this myth about decreolization is one that's being repeated even in Haiti, even by well-meaning linguists and educators who are afraid that Creoles will be decreolized, that Haitian Creole will decreolize if they are introduced in certain contexts, or if they are using vocabulary that's technical. So if a Creole textbook starts using technical terms, then it means that the language is being decreolized and risk dying out. You see, so this is one case where well-meaning educators, well-meaning linguists have been brainwashed by colonial scholars into certain beliefs about the native language. Now, let's look at one case where anti-Blackness can be seen even among the most progressive and enlightened Creole speakers. So here, this is a case that's actually quite close to us as linguists, because the LSA, Margaret Thomas, was an archivist for the LSA. She had a piece about Firmin. And Firmin is interesting, actually, because if you look at some of his claims, you can see this clear link between global geopolitical hegemony and, in this case, internalized racism among someone actually was very worried about racism. Because what Firmin believed, although he was a staunch defender of racial equality, he wrote a beautiful book that you can see here in the slide on the equality of human races. And this book was in response to this anthropologist in France called Comte de Gobineau. So Comte de Gobineau wrote this major book that was well quoted back then about the inequality of human races. So in response, Firmin argued very cogently that Gobineau was wrong, that in fact, the races cannot be unequal, they have to be equal. But yet, even at Firmin, he himself believed that Haitians, in order for them to evolve mentally, they have to speak French. So which means that in effect, the majority of Haitians, those who speak Creole only, that's the majority, they are not yet evolved. So even as Firmin was arguing for the equality of human races, and he had some very strong arguments for that, but he himself believed that Haitians who don't speak French are not, quote unquote, evolved yet. So in effect, his own beliefs about his own linguistic beliefs undermine his belief in racial equality. This is quite striking. And these quotes are of similar nature, from very nationalist intellectuals. Here, this is Enoch Trouillot, who consider Creole a handicap because of alleged structural deficiencies. And in 3, this is actually a historian who was once president of Haiti for a very short time, Laissez Manigat. And in 2010, after he was president, he even called Creole a limitation and an infirmity. So this is a president, a historian, who calls our national language, which is recognized as national and official by the constitution of the country, and he calls it a limitation and an infirmity. Again, these are cases of hegemony to an utmost degree. But yet, we can link these anti-Creole beliefs to claims by linguists. For example, Manigat, one reason why he believed that Creole was a handicap, because he believed that Creole would have started as a pidgin, which he called petit nègre, which is an interesting term that we won't have time to go into. And this is also what I believed in when I was a child. But this notion of Creole coming from pidgin, which for Manigat was a reason why it could be a handicap for Creole speakers, is one that you find in linguistic textbooks. So what you see here is your classic definition of Creole languages from most textbooks, which is that Creoles come from pidgin. So most of you are linguists, so we don't have to belabor this point. But I think that this definition is the classical one that you find in linguistic textbooks. The pidgin is supposed to be quote unquote macaronic. This is a term from Bickerton. And then as the children learn the pidgin, they develop a new language ab ovo, from the egg. And that's why Creoles are supposed to be very simple, because they are the first linguistic, bona fide linguistic system out of this linguistic scrap, linguistic vacuum. So the question that I've been asking myself, along with a few colleagues, Seleko Mufwene and Abo, is really, are there linguistic traits that are found in the history of Creole languages and that are not found in the history of non-Creole languages. And because of time, we won't spend much time about this, but you can read articles by myself, by Mufwene, by Enoch Abu, by others, that basically that the answer is no. It's on the linguistic standpoint, there is no such thing as a Creole feature or a Creole set of features that would make Creole languages stand apart from other languages. And a very clear argument will involve the history of English. So English, in terms of macaronicity, in terms of language mixing, in many ways, the English lexicon is much more mixed, much more macaronic than the lexicon of Haitian Creole, which is mostly from French. So I like to say that English has out-Creole Haitian Creole, even though Haitian Creole is a most Creole of Creole. So it clearly shows you the contradiction in this set of assumptions. And French too, I mean, in many ways, if you look at the history of French as compared to Latin, because often, so if you look, for example, at the textbook at the book by Thorson and Kaufman about linguistics, they have this idea that one way to measure Creole formation or Creoleness is to look at the gap between the lexicon in terms of its inheritance and the syntax. So if in the language you see that there is a certain degree of correspondence between the lexica of the languages, like in the case of Haitian Creole and French, you see that most of the words come from French, but the structures are quite different. So therefore, that's a symptom of Creole formation. Then if we apply that method to French and Latin, we come up with something similar, that in many ways, French belongs to different types when it comes to, say, word order, scrambling, case markings, etc. And these are very cherry-picked features, but to make the point that in terms of typology, French and Latin are quite distant. And this is not a new insight. So actually, Antoine Meillet, a well-known historical linguist, back in the early 20th century, he actually observed that French belongs to different type than Latin. So from that perspective, French too would have out-Creoled Haitian Creole, because if you compare Latin to French and then French to Haitian Creole, in many ways, Haitian Creole is closer to French than French is to Latin. So here, even if you look at the patterns of formation of, say, Romance versus Creole languages, and here I'm going to be using some maps from my good friend Tadiko Mufwene, and what you see there is that the patterns of formation for Romance languages out of contact between Romance speakers and speakers of quote unquote, back then they were called barbaric speakers of Frankish and Celtic languages. So this is how the Romance languages evolved, right? But then if you look at the history of Creoles in the Indian Ocean and in the Caribbean, the French-based Creoles, you see a similar pattern of contact, migration, giving rise to new varieties, to new languages, right? So even from that perspective, the history of Creole languages resemble the history of non-Creole languages. So I thank Sally for these maps. And then we can also look at more recent work. So this is, I like to call this slide, big data against the big dogmas of Creole Exceptionalism. Because in this case, those three authors, Blassie, Michaelis, and Haspelmath, what they did is to look at massive sets of data. And what they showed is that when you compare Creoles to non-Creoles, what you see is that the grammars of Creole languages do inherit aspects of the grammars of the languages that are in contact, very much like what you see in the history of English and of French. So therefore, from all these corners of linguistic work, there is little empirical data to make us believe that Creoles were created ab ovo from pigeons. So I think we can basically, for now, agree with scholars like Meyer and Morskin that really, from a linguistic standpoint, so Creoles are just languages like any other languages. And the term Creole makes sense strictly from a historical and social perspective. And this is what Mufwene has been claiming for quite a long time, that as a term, Creole doesn't have any structural linguistic bite. It only makes sense from a point of view rooted in history and society, right? So this is a recent paper by myself and Enoch, where we proposed this, what we call a new theory of Creole formation, meaning that you don't need a special theory for Creoles. All you need to assume is that Creoles emerge like any other groups of languages, and then that should be enough to account for Creole formation. So it's a nuance theory, meaning that there is no extra baggage that's needed to account for Creole formation. And then now what we have to ask is why this insistence on putting Creole in a special typology outside of the typology of normal languages. And this map basically suggests that these claims, these exceptional claims about Creole languages are embedded in the very history of Creole studies, meaning the history of this triangular trade, where the Europeans, the goal was to make the Africans into lesser humans. And for that mission to succeed, for the Africans to be considered lesser, the languages had to be made lesser. Because the Europeans, remember, this was they were enlightened intellectuals, right? So they had to convince themselves and the Africans that the Europeans were superior. And language was used as a measure of humanity. This goes back to philosophers like Humboldt and many others who really believe that language can be used to measure grades of humanity. What I have here, these are examples where I like to show that what's happened in linguistics with Creole languages find analogs throughout space and time. So if you look at the history of the Spanish conquest of the Americas, Nebrija with Queen Isabella, they also understood that language has this power of oppressing people. So Nebrija gave Queen Isabella this grammar of Spanish, and the goal, as Nebrija said, was that language is a consort of empire, and therefore, if the Spaniards can impose Spanish on the Incas, the Aztecs, the Mayas, then they will put a yoke. They will be able to put this linguistic yoke on the barbarians. And the same is true of the British in India. They use English as a way to oppress the Indians. And if you look at the rise of linguistics, so the very first family tree model from August Schleicher, clearly he had this idea that one can also use language. So if you look at the quote in 3, that language is of significance not only to systematize humanity, but also you can use the various stages of languages as measures of grades of men. So this was one of his goal in coming up with this family tree model for language change. Okay, so now let's see now in politics, in world history, how these notions have played out. So here I'm going to go back and focus on the case of Haiti, where language there too has played a role as instrument of empire. And Giscard d'Estaing, who was president of France in the 70s, he has this, what I find to be actually quite a very clear explanation of the goals of Francophonie. Francophonie is this movement it's a political movement to gather nations into this umbrella of French as a language. And what Giscard d'Estaing made very clear back in the 70s in an interview in this newspaper called Le Monde, he said clearly that the goal of this movement of Francophonie is for political power, because with language you can create more dynamism on world markets. So basically the goal of Francophonie is one of power. And I'm going to show you now a little video, very quick video of Macron and Jovenel Moïse. So Macron is the current French president, Moïse is the current Haitian president, and you can see very clearly how Francophonie come to bear on this political chess that the French are playing in.
La francophonie est également un élément qui nous unit, Haïti faisant partie justement des membres fondateurs, et je souhaite que nous puissions encourager la région de manière très concrète, et nous allons nous y employer les initiatives que vous prenez en ce sens.
Au cours de nos échanges, nous avons convenu de renforcer les liens commerciaux entre les deux pays. La coopération en matière d'éducation à tous les niveaux, surtout l'enseignement supérieur et la formation professionnelle. Vous pouvez compter sur nous. Nous sommes en train de travailler pour que le français, comme nous l'avons si bien dit, qui est notre langue officielle, soit en fait une langue, la langue de la CARICOM aussi. Et nous sommes en train de travailler pour que nos frères de la Martinique et de la Guadeloupe puissent participer aussi dans ce grand mouvement de la CARICOM, parce que la CARICOM, ce sont des pays de la Caraïbe, et je pense que Martinique et Guadeloupe font partie aussi de la CARICOM. Je vous remercie.
Merci beaucoup. Merci, messieurs, dames.
So there's a lot to say about this video, but notice that at the end, Macron speaks in Creole with Moïse, say, merci, messieurs, dames. Yet Moïse claims that Haiti has one official language, French, and that he, Moïse, is going to push French as a working language for CARICOM, which is this Caribbean community where actually there are many more Creole speakers than there are French speakers. It's a fact that there are about a quarter of the Caribbean that speaks Haitian Creole or a French-based Creole, and French is spoken by much, much, much less. So why? Obviously, this is not in the interest of Haiti, it's in the interest of France. And something else to think about is the way in which this power of French in Haiti has been entrenched as a marker of prestige. And this is where sociolinguistics can come into play to understand the various ways in which French works as a prestige marker, with Creole working as a lower class status, which goes very far in cementing the power of the elite. And this marking of French as a prestige language comes from all quarters. Though I talked about the school system, and here I'm going to show you an interesting short video, again, showing how the Francophonie machine weighs heavily on the hegemony in Haiti. So here you're going to see a famous Haitian as part of the Académie Française. So listen to his speech here. And here what we're going to see is yet another symptom of this linguistic brouhaha eye.
Moi, j'ai dit aux gens que quand je parle français, je me sens élégant.
So here's that me, I tell people when I speak French, I feel elegant. So this is a Haitian promoting, again, the elegance of French over Creole. But yet, now, what do the law say in Haiti? Well, we've seen Macron, Moïse, we've seen a writer like Ferrière, all of them seeming to ignore the fact that Creole is Haiti's national language, and it's one of two official languages. So according to the law, what you see here is the Constitution in Creole, 2 articles, 5 and 40. And 5 says very clearly that we have 2 official languages, with Creole being the national one. So, but yet what you see in practice is that presidents do violate. So, comment you dis bonsoir. Dis bonsoir. Okay. So, but the presidents and writers like Ferrière violate those rules. Now, with more time, we would go into all the costs that this implies on basically the school system in Haiti, the chances for social promotion, etc. But now, what I want to go and discuss with you is yet another aspect of this hegemony. And here, what I want to look at is the role that institutions have been playing in Haiti, starting with the Ministry of Education, looking at the university, etc. And so what you see there in this slide is the fact that most of the institutions, the ministry, the university, they all promote French, mostly French. If you look at their websites, the communications, it's the written language typically is French, excluding Creole. And more recently, now this is a document from December 2020. So what you see in this document, actually, which is very striking, is that this is a new document that is meant to orient the school system. And it's called the document to orient the curricula of the school system. And what you see here is that they are promoting the use of Creole as a language for teaching from preschool up to the 4th grade, which is the first cycle of the fundamental school. And starting in the 5th grade, what you see highlighted here, studying in the 2nd cycle of the fundamental, is only French. So what this implies is that the schools are supposed to teach only in French, starting in the 5th grade. But yet, Creole and French are subject matters. So what does this mean in practice? Now, you need to think about what this implies in practice. It implies that a Haitian kid who comes from a home where they speak Creole only, they are taught first in Creole, and studying in the 5th grade, they have to now be learning everything in French. And now, since Creole, French, and English are going to be among the subject matters that they have to learn, so those kids, according to this document, will be learning Creole in French. They'll be learning about the native language, Creole, in a foreign language. Not only that, they will also be learning French, English, and Spanish in French, which they don't speak natively. Quite a striking proposition from the Ministry of Education. And at the same time, Creole is supposed to be the national language. Now, this is not just about education. As you can see here, this also affects the justice system, because in the courts, when you go to court in Haiti, if you're a Creole only speaker, the judge, the lawyers, they all speak French, and you as the accused, if you speak only Creole, you have no clue what's happening. So it's only at the very end you find out whether or not you're going to go to jail or you're going to be set free. Now, looking at, I'm going to focus a little bit on UNESCO's role in this pattern of human rights violations. And the case of UNESCO, especially now, is even more spectacular because UNESCO has just launched this celebration of indigenous languages. So there is this, as you know, as linguists, the LSA is part of this movement to promote and to defend indigenous languages. But yet, when you go to Haiti, what do you see on the ground? Although on the ground, there is this awareness that Creole is important for information, but what I'm showing you here are examples of conferences held in Haiti by UNESCO, and the language of discourse is often French and French only. So this actually was quite striking. It was a webinar to celebrate access to information, and yet the webinar was in French, a language that in effect blocks access to information. And so here, this is a slide about the fact that Haiti has a special place in the history of UNESCO, because Haiti is where UNESCO did this research back in the late 40s, early 50s. So they published this book in 1953, and this book is a beautiful argument on the importance of native languages. So basically, UNESCO has this very long history in Haiti and beyond of producing scientific results as to why it's important to use the native language. And even today, so at MIT, so we have this team, so we're collaborating with UNESCO Haiti in the context of disseminating Creole materials for education. But where you find quite a striking contrast between this mission statement about the mother language, the mother tongue, and actual practice at UNESCO is when they have these conferences, when they have those activities where they create and transmit knowledge. And those activities are mostly conducted in French only. And when I myself, I often take part in these activities. So when I challenge UNESCO and say, well, but there's a disconnect here, because how do you expect to promote inclusion while you produce all this knowledge, these conferences, in the language that most Haitians do not speak? For example, this was a conference on inclusive education, and yet the conference took place in the language that excludes most Haitians, except for one speaker at the very end who spoke in Creole and who actually made a point to say, well, we have to speak Creole to be inclusive, but most speakers spoke only in French. So what you have to ask is why this contrast, even when it comes to discussing inclusive education. So, and here we have to get into some of the nitty-gritty of these patterns, because when I do challenge UNESCO's leadership around this use of French, and which excludes most Haitians, so in this case, there was a conference on disinformation, and I raised the point, if it's going to be translated in French, English, and Spanish, why not also include Creole? And to my surprise, when I raised that point, when I asked why not use Creole as well alongside French, English, and Spanish, I was accused of defaming UNESCO, that this very question is one that UNESCO finds like a defamation. And worse yet, a couple of weeks ago, there was a conference at UNESCO. It was a live Facebook webinar. And again, the announcement was sent only in French. And I asked what you expect to also have the announcement in Creole, given UNESCO's mission. And to my surprise, the leaders of UNESCO Haiti blocked me from commenting on that conference. So as you can see in this slide, when I went to the Facebook Live to try to comment on the content, I was blocked. And I was also asked I was removed from the WhatsApp group discussing UNESCO's Haiti's activities in Haiti. So that was what we should ask then. So what's the impact of these practices when it comes to this mission of cultural and linguistic diversity? Now, when it comes to the Caribbean, when a conference is being held in French, English, and Spanish with no use of Creole, in effect, what it does, it excludes 25% of the Caribbean population, which are most fluent in Haitian Creole. Right? So these are numbers for statistical numbers, and you can see that Haiti has about 12 million speakers. So that's really around 25% of the Caribbean, and most in Haiti speak Creole only. So now what we should ask is, what's the intent of UNESCO's actual practices vis-a-vis cultural and linguistic diversity? So what you can see here in this document, it's by the AOF, which is the Agence Universelle de la Francophonie. And the argument here that you can see on this slide is that there's a plea that there should be more French being used to promote the output of scientific research in France. Actually, it's a very strong argument. The idea is that if you look at various fields of science in France, there is one field that's still very active, very innovative, and that's math. And the point being made in this article here is that the reason why math is so strong in France as compared to other fields is because French mathematicians keep using French instead of using English. So the point here is that using French for science in France promotes the quality of science there. So what one should ask then, and this is exactly what the point I've made, is that if we now go to Haiti then, so what we would want, if we want to fulfill UNESCO's mission for knowledge being equally produced and shared, then we would want to promote Creole, because the same way that the use of French in France promotes mathematics in France, then if we think of a country like Haiti, we also want to promote Creole in the service of sciences, because otherwise Haiti will suffer from blocking the creativity of Creole speakers. Okay, but the point, I mean, if you look deeper at what's happening in terms of the Francophonie movement, it's like if it's a zero-sum game where diversity for UNESCO and for AUF, which is the Agence Universelle de la Francophonie, which works with UNESCO, is basically, diversity is a zero-sum game between French and English. So when the French at this level talk about diversity, what they see is the presence of French in Anglophone environments. So the two main players are supposed to be French and English. And this is what you can see in this cartoon here, where one speaker is on the left is talking about math in French with lots of code switching into English. And then the speaker on the right goes and say the F word in English. So it's a very colorful illustration of this notion of diversity from the French perspective, where what matters is French versus English, not Creole. So Creole doesn't count in this environment. So with all this in the background, what I want to do in part 3, in the last part of this talk, this is why I want to be optimistic. So I want to briefly show models that I trust can put linguistics and education on the right path as part of the Black Lives Matter movement for human rights and social justice. So the starting point of our work, so as you've seen so far, is that 40%, not just Haiti, but 40% of the world's students are in a dire predicament. Although I'm talking about Haiti, but what I'm going to describe here is true for millions of students, mostly in the global South, where they speak one language at home. In Haiti, it's Creole. Only few speak French, from 3 to 10%. But yet, we have to go to school and we have to learn in a foreign language. And obviously, this is a recipe for disaster. So in Haiti, only 10% went to primary school, will finish high school. Only 1% goes to university. But what's worse, perhaps, is that the learning is done by rote from the very beginning. And of course, what you hear in the media is that Haiti is the poorest country in the hemisphere. But really, what one should say is that Haiti is the most impoverished country. And one vector of impoverishment is exactly this nexus of language and miseducation, which is actually supported by the Ministry of Education, by the university system, by human rights organization, and by really almost every institution in the country. So the roadmap ahead is one that's inspired by Frantz Fanon, really, because as Fanon says, the prognosis is in the hands of those who are willing to get rid of the rotten structure, of the worm-eaten roots of the structure. And really, this is what the challenge is. The entire structure of the way language and education work in Haiti is a reflex of hegemony. And how do you get rid of that structure? And the end goal is that. The end goal is to create a level playing field by having languages being accepted on a par. So linguistic equality is a condition for political equity. So this is a picture of when we first launched MIT-Haiti back in 2010. And so I like this slide because it basically summarizes our roadmap. So the current system is French-based, is very much test-driven, rote learning. It's little relevance to actual problems. It's all note-taking on paper, limited hands-on, and want to get rid of that and want to move to what I've called the Trois Roches d'Ifé model. So this is a classic site in the Haitian landscape where a big pot is being cooked on 3 rocks. We call them the 3 rocks of fire that have to keep the pot stable. And so in my perspective, the 3 rocks are the language, the pedagogy, active learning, and then technology. And then what's cooking in the pot is education for all. So this is another rendering of the same schema. Right? So these are the 3 bases, the 3 pillars of the approach: the native language, active learning, where students can actually can help build their own knowledge, and the use of technology. And technology is not just computers, but it's just anything that allows manipulation of the concepts you're learning. So this is I love this video because it shows those kids. It was the 3rd session using computer games to learn math in Creole. They were learning about place value, about units, tens, thousands. And it was in Creole, and they enjoyed it so much that they burst spontaneously in song and laughter and dance. So I'll play a bit of it. Those kids wanted to come back over the weekend. Do you imagine 10-year-olds wanting to come back and do math over the weekend? So I like to tell my colleagues in Haiti, can you ever imagine that happening if they were doing math in French? No way. And the kids, this is the beautiful part. At the end of this pilot, we went around all the kids to ask them, how they felt about the use of Creole to do math, because for them it was something that was so innovative, Creole on computer games. And the response was so refreshing. Most of them was like this girl.
Mais só penser que il t'a plus bon pour faire en créole ou en français?
En créole.
Pour qui ça?
On capit bien comprendre.
Okay.
You see, that was the classic answer. So the kids were clear. I want to do math and Creole because that's how I can understand it. But there were a couple of kids, and those cases are so telling. Those are the kids who most needed to learn the math because they were having trouble with the math. But yet this kid listened to him
Quelle langue pour nous servir avec pour tu jouer au français ou bien créole?
Français.
Pour qui ça?
Parce que je comprends. Je comprends français.
Vous comprenez français? Hein?
Oui.
Donc vous avez préféré pour jouer en français?
Oui.
Ok. Vous parlez français?
Je ne parle pas français. Non.
Non, je comprends français. Si vous parlez français, comment on fait comprendre français?
Je connais français.
Au français? Et créole, est-ce que vous connaissez au créole?
Je connais tout.
Vous connaissez tout mon créole?
Oui.
Et pourtant, on dit que vous avez préféré tes voitures en français. Pour qui ça?
Qui ça?
Vous dites que vous avez préféré tes voitures en français. Pour qui ça? Pour qui ça, l'osni?
Quand on parle.
Tu peux qu'on parle?
Oui.
Ok. Ok, l'osni. M'abdou, grand merci.
So this kid, he wasn't doing so well in math, but he wanted to do math in French. Why? Because he wanted to learn French. So this is, to me, perhaps the clearest case of what Toni Morrison told us about the Blue SI. So it doesn't matter that speaking French in this context won't help him, but it's his French as what will make him elegant, what will make him human, because that's what his parents tell him, that's what he sees all around him, that without French, you're not really human. So he wants to learn French. He doesn't care about math. To be human, to be elegant, you've got to speak French. You see, that's the tough challenge. And this is a result of these institutions promoting French as the one accepted, formal, elegant language. You see, and so you can read more about this experiment that we did with these kids in this article. It's on my website at MIT. In that same school, we also had a project started before I went there with the school founders, Chris Lowe and Abner Sauveur. And the basic impetus of that program, of that project that they launched, was to have the kids write their own stories in Creole. And there too, you can see the joy of these kids when learning in Creole. And the results are amazing. Those kids are learning to read and write and math so much better than the kids all around them in other schools using French.
Li pi bon pour chaque ti moun apprendre dans livre pa yo. Parce que si nous chaque apprendre dans livre pa nous t'a avancer plus rapide. Mais là vient avec français même professeur parfois le gêner dans dictionnaire pour le cours. Mais langue maternelle nous connaissons bien, c'est facile pour tout le monde apprendre.
Quand je me sens mal à l'aise, c'est là moi faire un livre pour comme et puis les gens m'ont appelé, là dit oh c'est Kevin son qui t'a fait livre ça me senti mal à l'aise.
Ça me plus remet dans le livre nous fait ensemble c'est yo que des gars ou
me sens fier parce que les élèves yo bon moi titre livre premier bagage titre la sorti na yo même et puis yo même encore bon moi phrase pour yo capable écrire livre ça facilite pour li plus rapide et comme ça tout pour yo apprendre et puis ça suscite yo venir un grand écrivain dans la vie.
So in these two projects, so the work was done mostly with the kids and the teachers were helping. But one thing that we found is that it would be crucial to have the whole group of teachers at the point when they're being trained to get on the program of using Creole. And this is how we launched this MIT-Haiti Initiative. And I'll just quickly show you what we did with the teachers at the university level. So now this is in Port-au-Prince, working with university professors who are going to be training teachers.
C'est première fois on voit effort fait comme ça pour tout un logiciel dans niveau ça, dans niveau technologique ça, effort arrivé fait puis on mettre dans créole. Donc la plus accessible parce que il était clair que moyen que on apprenne plus bien, c'est l'on apprendre dans langue maternelle, dans langue maman papa.
Donc li sorti dans cadre théorique là pour rentrer dans une véritable pratique de laboratoire, même le laboratoire là pas réel, mais ça l'a fait dans le logiciel là, c'est un coup laboratoire est devant.
Donc kounia professeur vient réaliser qui gens outils ça yo ka aider yo dans former une nouvelle génération professeurs, maîtres, maîtresses ak étudiants qui ka vinn plus créatif, qui ka commencer faire bon genre recherche dans sciences et mathématiques et puis comme ça y a cap contribuer dans le développement économique pays en tout bon vrai.
If you want to read more about this project, so we have an article published in Language a couple of years ago, where we show the changes that we've managed to accomplish, and they are mostly changes of attitudes in 3 dimensions: vis-à-vis Creole as a language of instruction, vis-à-vis active learning, and also vis-à-vis technology in teaching. So the details are in this article. You can find it on my website at MIT, so you get to learn more about it. So meanwhile, what we've been doing is also producing more materials in Creole, so at the very high levels. So we have this guide physique written by Paul Belloni, myself, Genda Stamp, with the help of a large group of Haitian educators, too large to cite them all here because of time. And in terms of the linguistics, one thing that we're also doing as we're developing these tools in Creole, we're also expanding the next of the language. In fact, what we're doing, and this is something that my colleague Paul Belloni could speak more in details if you were here, is how by producing new terms in Creole, actually what we're doing also is we're coining new terms that are in many ways superior than the French equivalents, because we have this advantage of producing terms that match our current understanding of the science, whereas some of the French terms, they reflect an outdated understanding of the science. So in the case of terms like tension or terms like intensité, these are technical terms that in French reflect an earlier stage of knowledge. So now in Creole, when we develop new terms to express these concepts, we have this advantage that we can create terms that actually are more accurate in the scientific understanding of the concepts. And then our recent step, the most recent step in the project, is to go beyond STEM, is to go beyond science and math and technology and engineering. And what we've done now is to create this platform since last year. So my colleague and friend Hans Miller in mathematics at MIT, we've launched this MIT-Haiti.net platform, MIT-Ayiti. And what we think is that this can be a real game changer in terms of producing materials for disenfranchised communities that still lack access to knowledge in the native language. Because here what we're doing is to gathering educators in Haiti, abroad, who have the capacity and who are willing to contribute to knowledge in Creole. So it's basically crowdsourcing in all levels, from kindergarten all the way up to university, in all fields, not just STEM. And it's actually, the results have been so far quite amazing. So this is a team here. It's a small team. And if we had more time, I would have you hear some of them. Our job is really to curate and to invite educators all over Haiti, the diaspora, and they send us the materials, and we work on the Creole, on the formatting, making sure that there's a component of active learning, that it's Haiti-centric. It's not implementing yet another white normative gaze like most Haitian textbooks do. We try to make sure that our approach honors the Lakou, honors the Haitian history and the Haitian culture. So that's where we are. And to put it now in the larger context, I just cite this recent paper by Hudley Mallinson and Buchholz about racial justice linguistics, right? So in a way, I feel that this work that we're doing does match those three criteria that Charity Hurdley, Mallinson, and Buchholz have been presenting in their own work on racial justice linguistics. The notion that our work as linguists have to really engage with the fact that linguistics itself arose as part of white supremacy. So therefore, we need work now that has social impact, that acknowledge that history of racism in linguistics, that I think I've documented here in this talk, and that can help to reduce the race gap that still diminishes the field by excluding scholars of color. And this being Canada, I could not end without honoring the fact that this Canada is a home of First Nations. Here I must include this reference to work that has this potential to transform Indigenous communities. This work being done by scholars at MIT, started by Ken Hale, now Navin Richards, my colleague from the son of Ken. He leads this MIT's Indigenous Language Initiative. Look it up on the MIT website. And JC Littldo, that you see in the picture here, JC now is passing a Wampanoag language, which was defunct. She's passing it to new generations of Wampanoag speakers. And I thank JC for telling me how to write "thanks a lot" in Wampanoag. And I think this is, again, the kind of model that you at Concordia and in Canada can, in various degrees, you should not already do that, emulate, which is to honor the contributions of Indigenous linguists. And to close, I'll say thank you to you all and to this team that I've been working with. And as we say in Haiti, mea pile shai palu, meaning that many hands I tend to load. So now I look forward to your feedback, to any concrete suggestions you can make so we can move forward. Thank you.
Merci en pile, Michel. Wow, vraiment, présentation ça. It has been really amazing to hear you present this work. I think that it is so grounded, and I really appreciate how you've connected this to many areas of how this relates to the fields of study, you know, and our understanding of what Black Lives Matter, social justice, and et cetera, how that infuses itself in whether that be on language, education, technology, and also our, you know, our political framework. I think that, you know, being based in Canada, but also being based in Quebec, and the particular language politics that come with that, it's just been a very great presentation. I'm opening the floor up for questions at this moment. You can either put questions in the chat box or raise your hand, and then if you want to speak out your question with your own wonderful voices.
You mean raise your real hand or raise your Zoom hand?
Raise the hand with ideally with the little reactions thing, just so we know the order of when people have raised their hands. But if you want to also raise your hand in person, there's just many screens to look at. So ideally with the reactions button. But you know, if there aren't questions right off the bat, Michel, I'd ask you maybe a question to
Sure.
start. I think a lot about myself. I do research around the knowledges and methodologies and practices that come from the Black home, and how essential that is in terms of being able to pass down our languages, our sense of self, and et cetera. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, in particular around the Haitian context, which has, you know, two separate kind of methodologies of how that's worked. So if I look at my mom's life, so my mom being born in Haiti, and how in order to kind of continue this hegemony, as you say, in her home, right, as she was growing up, it was like, once you go to school, we no longer allow you to speak Creole at home, right? And so how does that become an issue in terms of preserving our understanding of what the Black home is, if once you enter the institution, you are no longer allowed to, even in your home, speak that language? And then I think about this also in terms of my generation. So being, you know, born here in Montreal, having a child, And so at this very moment, the reason I'm able to be here with you all is because my mother is watching my 3-year-old and speaking to him in Creole, which again, within our own political context, in terms of language in Montreal is very interesting, because the idea of him speaking Creole for the outside world is kind of seen as detrimental to his capacity to engage with French and English and the other languages of this particular context. So yeah, I just throw this question to you.
Those are two very good questions, Anik. When I was a child, I think my parents were convinced that in order for me to succeed, in order for me to learn properly, I have to speak French. So like what you described, my mom would punish me for speaking Creole at home. Although all my friends at school, when playing soccer, we could only speak Creole playing soccer. We couldn't imagine speaking French when playing soccer or giving jokes. You see, because I think they misunderstood, what it meant to learn. They thought that, and you can see it even today in Haiti, that like this kid that was interviewed, and he said that I want French for math because he wants to learn French, because it's this misguided notion that learning, being educated means to speak French. That's what we have to change, you see, and we can only change it, and that's why I'm merciless with the Haitian politicians, the Minister of Education, the UNESCO folks, because their practices enforce this bluest eye, making the kids believe that French is the one respectable language. Because even if you say in the curricula that Creole is the language of instruction for the first 4 years, even if you say in the laws that Creole is national and official, that's what the laws say, Creole is our one national language. But if in practice, if all you write is in French, if at university all the documentation is in French, all the websites are in French, the message is very clear that Creole does not count. Creole is an inferior language. So there is no way around it. And they don't want to understand that, because I think there's a benefit for them as individuals to use French, because it gives them that prestige that you heard from Affairière. Moi, quand je parle français, je me sens élégant. When I speak French, I feel elegant. And that's the thing that those leaders have. So you have to find a way to switch that attitude. And I think here we can be inspired from the movement of the Black Panthers, the Black Power movement, where there was a time in the US when Black kids wanted to play with white dolls, right? That famous experiment where Black kids were asked, which doll do you prefer, the black or the white doll? And most Black kids would say the white doll. And then they would ask them, so which doll looks like you? And they would say, oops, the black doll looks like me. And some kids would start crying because they had said, the white doll is nicer, the white doll is smarter, the white doll is more honest, the white doll is sweeter. And then they see that the black doll is what looks like me. You see, but the Black Power movement, the Black Panthers, that has changed a bit, not totally. There is still that degree of alienation because of what Morrison called the bluest eye. But this requires really, really hard work. And you have to be merciless. And I applaud you, and you're very lucky that you have your mother to help your child speak Creole. And it's not either or. I think the Hawaii case is such a telling case. In Hawaii, you see the kids who now go to these immersion schools in Hawaiian, a language that was moribund, and due to activism and some amazing linguists there, that I really admire, the linguists in Hawaii, who've managed to revive Hawaiian. And what they've measured, and here the data are very clear, those kids who go to Hawaiian schools where they're immersed in their ancestral language, though many of them are not fluent speakers in it, but because it's the language of the ancestors, they take pride in being speakers of Hawaiian. Those kids are actually quite well. It's not, they even learn English better. In fact, the results are actually very striking. Hawaiian kids who go in those immersion schools in Hawaiian, they eventually manage to learn English better than those Hawaiian kids who also actually speak pidgin, what they call pidgin English. Those Hawaiian kids who are immersed in English-speaking schools, they don't do so well as compared to those kids who honor the culture. It's not just, you see, it goes beyond language. It's also this pride that you have in honoring your native language. You see, because in Haiti, those kids who go to school where they're told that Creole is broken, like I did, those kids, I think they grew up with first of all, they are bad learners because they never learn to really write properly or to read properly. They learn to parrot French. They don't learn to read in the native language, so they never learn to read well. But second of all, they learn with a deficient mentality. They believe that what the mom speaks, what the friends speak is inferior. So they are inferior, you see. Mm-hmm. So I think you're very lucky that your son has that. So he'll be a proud Haitian.
Thank you. So we have quite a few hands up. I'm just going to be going in the order that they showed up. So Dylan, would you like to start us off?
Yeah, so I come at this, I have an interest in global politics, but I also study linguistics. So I couldn't help but notice in the little exchange you showed us between the Haitian president and Macron, how the president of Haiti was like looking to use French to form a relationship, particularly with Martinique and Guadeloupe, which are current French colonies. And you know, globally, this is like something that's, I mean, there's kind of some parallels when it comes to other former French colonies and stuff. And I just found that link interesting, and that leads me into, I know like the current Haitian government and stuff is very pro-Western, but I was wondering if like you found any support in your initiatives from like different elements in Haitian politics that are perhaps a bit more looking to reclaim the independence of Haiti, and perhaps with somebody like President Aristide, maybe a bit more open to like helping expand the status of Creole in Haiti, for example, I guess.
Yeah, that's a very good question that you're asking. It's a very complicated one.
Yeah.
You see, it's very complicated because the Haitian government is definitely not monolithic, right? So you have many leaders and politicians who are definitely invested in French because it's often a matter of personal interests, right? Because the French there are very calculating. They do try to control the way that education is going because they see it as a market, as a way to increase the power in the region, right? So it's a geopolitical chess game where certain Haitians see that they can benefit, they can benefit the families, benefit themselves, the parties, by aligning themselves with the French. You see, in the French, if you go to the Ministry of Education, you'll see that they have the operatives placed in various offices at the Ministry of Education. So you need politicians who have a certain strength to be able to resist that. And you mentioned Aristide. So Aristide had that kind of strength. When he was in power, he was definitely a huge promoter of Creole. In fact, when he came to the UN, I think he was the first ever Haitian president to speak Creole at the United Nations. And when he spoke Creole then, there was a major mess because nobody expected him to speak Creole. So but luckily, I think the person then was the head interpreter, was Haitian, and she was able to translate. But they weren't prepared to have someone translate from Creole into English or into other languages because most Haitians would go to the UN, they would speak French, not Creole. You see, so I still had this when I have to give him this credit, he was definitely in favor of Creole. But Martelly would then give us Jovenel Moïse. One would have expected, in fact, there was also hopes that as someone who made so much money as a pop star because of his Creole lyrics, as an artist, his fame is based on his use of Creole. So one would have expected him when he came into power to valorize Creole, but no, he did not. Why? Because he could see that he could benefit politically from aligning himself with Hollande. In fact, I have a video that I didn't show because of time, where Martelly is at the Élysée and he tells Hollande, please send us your retired teachers to make the new Haitian man. This is Martelly, the president of a nation that was independent in 1804. Dessalines, our first president, made it clear that we have to watch out because although we're free politically, if we allow the French to impose the culture on us, if the French can impose the language on us, then we will be made into slaves again. So the French will enslave us through the language and culture. That's what Dessalines said. And now to hear that Martelly going to the Élysée telling Hollande, please send us your retired teachers to create the new Haitian man teaching us French. You see, but obviously Martelly, he computed that there was some interest for him to carry favors with the French. So, but at the same time that Martelly was doing that, his prime minister, Laurent Lamotte, interestingly, was very much in favor of MIT-Haiti. Laurent Lamotte, as a prime minister, he came to MIT, we signed agreements, even with the Ministry of Education, to help with science and math education in Haiti. And we have, decrees that were signed by the then Minister of Education, Manigat. But those decrees are now in the drawers, collecting dust, you see. So in fact, that case goes exactly along your lines, Dylan, that in that particular government of Martelly, the president himself, Martelly, was pro-French, but his prime minister understood, perhaps because his father was a language teacher, he understood deeply the importance of using Creole, both for Haiti's sovereignty, but also to improve education. You see, so that's what I think that case is a classic one of exactly what you're saying.
We also have a question from, were you saying something, Dylan?
I was just saying thank you. I think that answers it pretty thoroughly.
Thank you, Dylan.
Thank you. Thank you for that question. The next question is with Anik.
Hello, I have a couple of questions, if that's okay.
Oh, please.
Yes, so in the case of Haiti, I wanted to say also in terms of the history that yes, it was the first independent Black nation, but it was also the only independent Black nation at that time. So, and I think that played a very important role in this hegemony that has been created and that's so deeply rooted in our society. And so in the process of figuring out how do we break this this nut that you were talking about, how do we bring awareness to this very clear contradiction, I wanted to ask you about any other examples that you would know of where there was a successful linguistic liberation. For example, like in Hawaii that you were speaking about, do you have any other examples?
Yes, one example that I have in mind, which I wish one day I could visit. Well, two examples that I have in mind actually, very different geographies, but in terms of the mother tongue, they resemble each other. One is Seychelles. So in Seychelles, they have a Creole as well. It's a French-based Creole, Seychellois, that they've made into the official language. And Seychellois is used quite prominently in various quarters that produce knowledge and wealth. So I would love to go to Seychelles and actually see it with my own eyes to understand how Seychellois works there and how well it's accepted. Because it's one thing to read research articles about the country versus being there and being able to observe what's happening. And another country where I've been, it's Finland. So if you look at the history of Finland, if you look at the way the Finnish language has been first excluded from the school system, the Swedish and then the Russians, then now Finnish is the main language of instruction from kindergarten all the way to university, you see? And what you see there is that now Finland has one of the best school systems in the world, and the use of Finnish as the primary language of instruction, I think it's correlated with the success as a school system. You see, and in a way, there's a similar history of reclamation of the Finnish speakers after being occupied by the Russian, understanding that for them to establish the sovereignty and for them to open up access to everyone, they had to promote and use the Finnish language in the school system. Before it was Swedish that was being used, when most Finnish didn't speak Swedish. Most Finnish people were Finnish speakers, you see? So that's actually a very interesting case. And another case actually one could think about in, given your question is the history of French in France. If you go back to René Descartes, when he wrote his Discours sur la méthode, back then most philosophers, most scientists in France, they were writing in Latin and Greek, right? So when Descartes wrote his Discours sur la méthode, when he wrote it in French, it was a revolution because people expected him to write in Latin. And he said very clearly that he's writing in French so that his compatriots could understand, and even said that I'm writing in French so that women can understand, because back then Latin was a language that was used by the elite, and women were not part of the elite. So he wanted to democratize education, to have his science accessible to everyone, and that was history, right? Fortunately, actually, his next book was in Latin because he got so much pushback that his next book was not in French. It was, but yet he created a model that French as the vernacular, meaning the vulgar language, could be used to express science. So that's another case like yours that you're thinking about. So one could look at the history of French, and that story is a very successful one, because today look at French, right? So that's why I like to remind Haitians that, look, one day our Creole will be exactly like French if we have the guts to be like Descartes. Because Haitians love Descartes. They love to say, je pense donc je suis. It's like, oh, but they don't realize that when Descartes wrote je pense donc je suis, it was like saying in Creole. It was like talking, writing in Creole. So there is hope.
And Nick, if you don't mind, just because I want to be mindful of the time.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, let me go after everyone.
Yeah, exactly. So I just it is 7:54. We were technically going to finish at 8. I don't know if you have it in you, Michel, to maybe stay a few minutes.
I'll stay until 10 p.m. No problem.
I felt that was the energy.
Yeah.
So I just, as we move on to the next questions, I'll take the next 4 questions, but if we could be just mindful of the space that we're taking, and then maybe we'll close off at 8:15 to allow everyone to kind of go to whatever evening that you were on yet. Okay, so the next question from Mahika.
Yes, hi. Basically, I just wanted to comment on the feeling of prestige when it comes to French. So I was born here, but I'm from Haitian background. And when I was young, my father just spoke French to me, and my mother spoke Creole to me, but mostly when she was like reprimanding me. So from there on, I caught up to learning the language, but I never spoke it at home because we were never encouraged to speak Creole. And even when I grew up, it was within my family and within the people that I know, it was widely understood that Creole was not a real language. Like, we never thought of it as a real language until I came into Curricula. In my first year of linguistics, I learned that Haitian Creole was a language.
Yes.
And concerning the prestige part, I just wanted to comment here, especially in Montreal, the Haitian community, especially my generation. So we're born into English, French, and Haitian Creole. And usually when we speak French, for me personally, I always get the comment by non-Black people or Quebecers that I speak, my French is, oh my God, tu parles bien français, you speak French very, very well. And I think it plays into that prestige of French, where we're reinforced that, okay, French is good. My French is good. I need to continue speaking French. And I speak to my peers and I get this comment over and over again where my French is praised. But for instance, if my first language would be Haitian Creole and I would have an accent when speaking French, then that would be negative. So it really plays into the small comments and how Haitian Creole is perceived. And also, especially in Montreal, Haitian Creole is used in slang. So because of that, because it's used in slang, the idea of Haitian Creole is bad because it's used in slang. It's a bit like African American vernacular where it's used in slang, so it has a negative connotation. And I feel like here too in Montreal, since Haitian Creole is used in slang, it has a negative connotation, and a lot of the younger generation are not aware of how beautiful of a language is, and actually speaking it, because from our parents we don't know that it's actually a language, beautiful language. So that it was just a comment on the idea of the Daniel Lafernière, the prestige.
Yes. Well, thank you for sharing that. Thank you for sharing that, Marika. So what you could do, when you meet people who devalue Creole, you can send them to the MIT-Haiti website, because there we have a section on the Creole language, and we have not only some very interesting pieces that analyze why the language is very important for Haitians, but also we have some beautiful poetry. I recommend, especially as a young Haitian woman, you might particularly enjoy this piece by Janie Bogart. She has a beautiful poem on our website called Samap Kitideye. Samap Kitideye. So I'm going to quickly put the link of a poem in the chat, and you can at your leisure go and listen to it. And then if anyone were to tell you in the future that Haitian is a debased language, a degenerate French, just have them listen to some poetry. Have them listen to artists, Big Tison Diffé. So there is so much that, but again, these are attitudes that are so deeply rooted in hegemony, as you noticed, that it takes daily practice to get rid of them.
Thank you. Thank you for that comment, Marika. The next question is from Christophe. Okay, please check the chat. Okay, let's do that quickly, Christophe. Est-ce que les universités haïtiennes ont aussi commencé à créer du matériel éducatif en créole comme votre initiative à MIT-Haiti? Y a-t-il un appui politique pour encourager les universités haïtiennes à poursuivre la voie de l'enseignement en créole, ou une quelconque reconnaissance gouvernementale des bienfaits de l'enseignement créole à tout niveau? And you can answer in English or French is the question.
This is a great question about the role of universities in this struggle. So there are pockets. So there are pockets of students and faculty in Haiti that are very much pushing the movement forward. So currently, I'm going to give you one example that you can look at again on the MIT-Haiti website. So there's a professor of sociology in Haiti called Jean Casimir. So Jean Casimir is probably the best known Haitian sociologist and historian, and he teaches at the Faculty of Human Sciences. And he has an amazing group of students who are really pushing a movement to teach history and sociology from a perspective rooted in what Jean calls the lakou. So the lakou, for anyone from Haiti, will know that the lakou is a communal space where families gather, where families share resources, they share all kinds of wealth, cultural wealth, and also economic wealth. So I mention him because that's one person and his group of students who are definitely in support of this movement. At the Faculty of Applied Linguistics, so the dean there is Renaud Gauvin. Dr. Gauvin is a linguist, and he has a series Tuesdays at the FLA. The FLA is the Faculty of Applied Linguistics, and the sessions are done typically in Creole. So I've been to many of the sessions. I've given talks there, and so there's a clear valuing of Creole. And for International Mother Tongue Day, which was this past Sunday, Doyen Gauvin gave a beautiful lecture on Facebook. It was a Facebook Live where he explained the importance of the mother tongue education. So you have these pockets of Haitian intellectuals who are very conscious of the importance of the mother tongue. But if you look at the structure, and this is where we have to keep pushing. The structure itself of the university is very much pro-French. So for example, just last week, there was a document published about a reform that's supposed to make this university among the best in the Caribbean in 2050. So that's the goal of the reform. And there is not one word in this reform about the use of Creole in that reform. And when I ask, so what about the use of Creole in that reform? Isn't that a major hole? As you're planning to make that needs to be much better. There is no way that one can produce a reform that will improve the university if the schools don't choose the students' languages. That's impossible to imagine a school that will perform at its best while using a language that most students do not speak fluently, you see? So yeah, so there is hope, but we have to keep pushing.
So our next question is from Brenda Paris, and I just want to take a moment to thank you so much for being here, Brenda. It is, you know, for anyone who doesn't know who Brenda Paris is, please take some time to look her up. Important pillar in terms of community activism, in terms of just so many of the ways that our world has been changed. So thank you so much for being here. And please, anyone who does not know Brenda Paris, please take some time to go look her up.
Oh dear. I wanted to do the opposite, to thank you. And I, you know, there's just so many wonderful things that are happening today, 2021, you know, that warm my heart, and I can't get into all of it, but I just wanted to thank our guest today, because he just I have a question at the end to ask, a quick question, and I want to just make quick interventions. But, you know, in terms of France, I want to say that I was in France in May 1968, and it changed my life. So here's France, French, you know, it started my activism, which was the workers' strike. And then fast forward, I'm just amazed how you just encompass from Toni Morrison to so many links. I haven't heard of, I've been very kind of close to the Haitian community, I would say, here in Montreal especially, since the arrival of the majority of Haitians in the 60s, so to speak. And I mean, I know to the point that there's actually a book was made on the Creole language, and my peers do speak Creole, you know, they make a point of it, but not necessarily making that link between their children and the language itself. I'm always jealous, because I mean, I was born here, my parentage heritage is from Barbados and Guyana, but we don't really have a distinct language that we can, we have a Creole, we have a Patois, and so on, which is used in the countries, but it is not used outside of, you know. And I think language is so very important. But you know, in terms of, geez, there's so many questions that I want to raise. I think I'm going to just raise this one question. Your analysis of the president of Haiti, because you made it between Aristide and Martelly. And by the way, Aristide came to Montreal when he was first ousted, and he sought refuge in the Union United Church, because there was a liberation minister there at that time, Reverend Gabriel, who had a lot in common with Aristide. So I got to be in his presence, not talking to him personally, but in his presence when he came here. So if I could just ask the question of how you would define the present president of Haiti right now. I'm gonna fast forward to that, but just thank you for your encompassing analysis and so many things put together, so many questions answered, and so on and so forth. So I will look up, I will go on the MIT-Haiti website, because it's not just it's not Haitian, it's the diasporic, you know? And I really, really thank you for this vast knowledge that you have. And even your I must say, as a linguist rather, the way just your English, your Creole, your French, your everything, and your politics is just amazing. I would say just amazing. So I don't know if you're at liberty to say how you would place the present president of Haiti.
That's such a complex question. You know, it's to do it justice. I don't know from what aspect you would want me to analyze the current president, but one thing which I can say is that, you know, currently there is a major crisis where it's shown in many ways that that there's a tendency for him to act as a dictator in this regard to Haitian law, and that's really a major concern to me. It's a major concern to me in terms of him overstaying his mandate, for example. So technically, his term was expired 2 weeks ago or so, and he decided that he would stay another year. In terms of the way he's created this intelligence agency that's legally very questionable, that reminds me of the Totomakut of Duvalier in terms of the expanded powers. So it's yeah. So there's a lot to say that goes beyond.
But that's that you give me an insight. So I don't want to put you on the spot, but you've given me an insight to where to place.
Yeah.
Question came up recently, and I have no idea. So
yes.
So
Yes, I'd be happy to send you a couple of things that that's been. So actually, Edwidge Denticat wrote a very short piece in the New Yorker a couple, I think last week, powerful piece that describes what we're currently living with Jovenel Moïse in Haiti.
Okay. Can I put my email in the chat?
Please do, yes.
Thank you. I'm not going to take up more time because there's so much.
Of course.
Thank you so much.
So, but thank you for your question. Thank you for your comments as well.
Thank you, Brenda. So we'll take one more question. We are getting to the last 5 minutes. So I hope I'm pronouncing this well. Kizian?
Yes, it's Yan.
Okay,
Thank
yeah,
you.
wonderful.
Yes. So good evening, Mr. DeGraff.
Good
Thank you so much
evening.
for a wonderful and very informative talk. It has opened my eyes to so many issues that I didn't even know existed in Haiti. And so it was very informative and very rich in the information that I now have that I didn't have previously. So it's more like a comment that I have. I'm an English-based Creole speaker. I was born in the islands of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. I'm very proud of my heritage and I'm very proud of my Creole. Yes, I understand there was some stigma on Creoles, but I never experienced what I've seen in your talk at all. Like I've never seen it in the school. And we were always encouraged. Yes, there's like, acrolec, mesolec, basolec, levels, but we were never forced or, pushed into not using or everyday Creole. We were always encouraged to speak it. So this in itself, I was happy with, and it's something that I continue to this day, even living in Montreal. I have my kids, I speak Creole with them. It's something that I celebrate. It's something that I'm proud of. And for this reason, I've always been interested in doing research on Creoles. I'm in my last year of linguistics programs. I'm in the honors program. So I'm looking for a thesis topic, and I've always had Creole circling in my head somewhere. So today's talk really kind of pushed me more and confirmed that that's probably my thesis that I will be doing. And, I think that is a way that we can help to bring some awareness to the Creole languages, even if it's not the French-based Creole, any Creole, as a matter of fact, because I've seen in some of your slides where they thought some Creole languages are defective. As linguists, we're taught to respect and consider all languages as fully functional languages. They're all complex in the same way. They're all complex in their own ways, I should say, but they all should be respected. So I think this is a way for linguists and anybody moving forward to help to build some respect for the Creole languages. And I think with respect, you're going to also improve the laws that are circulating, these Creole languages. So I think it starts with the respect and bringing the awareness out there into the communities, because there's so little work in that field of linguistics that not a lot of people even know what a Creole is or even realize that they existed. So I think what your talk did for me today was really push me in that direction. I just wanted to say thank you so much.
Thank you for sharing that. Thank you for sharing that. In fact, I know a bit about St. Vincent, and I've always dreamt of going there. I've heard about the black sandy beaches and the wonderful people there, and I have a couple of friends from St. Vincent. So maybe one day I'll go there. But yes, it would be great to have more research on St. Vincent and the linguistics of it. There's a beautiful book by Hubert Devonish where he looks at the language predicament of many countries in the Caribbean area, including all the way to Guyana. It's called Language and Liberation, Hubert Devonish. And that might be an interesting book to look at if you, in terms of the comparison between, say, what's happening in St. Vincent and what's happening in Haiti, because it's really a clear reflex of white supremacy. Why is it that in all the Caribbean, our local languages are so despised? In your case, you have a very different history and you're very lucky, but in most, even the names that are given to those languages, so in Kariakou, it's called broken English, right? So why it is, and this is a reflex of the history of domination in this area. So research is needed like people like you to, again, give value to our local languages. So, yeah, so good luck.
Thank you, everyone. It is, I appreciate so much the questions. There was a question in the chat box, so I'm going to get back to it. I know also, Anik, that you had some more questions. Unfortunately, we're getting close to the end of our time together, and I wanted to take a moment to remind us, I think you did such a wonderful job, Michel, in terms of breaking down the many different sites in which this exists. And so I really just wanted to kind of summarize that and remind people, you know, you started us with this conversation of the personal in terms of your autobiography and thinking about the interpersonal as an important site of where some of this violence begins in so many ways. And it's an important site where we can think about social justice. And so the interpersonal, the Black home, if we think of the first entry point in terms of where we can start to uproot this, I think that the personal is so important. And then I loved how you brought us out into this bigger sense of when we think about and talk about this idea of moving forward, Black Lives Matter, organizational social justice, and on a global level, really thinking about what is the practice that comes behind the vocabulary that we use in terms of what we think diversity is. How are we reproducing the same structures of hierarchy in the work that we move forward? And then I love that last call to action of what then are the solutions and what then are moments of hope, and how do we disrupt that structure? And I bring that call out to, you know, in this context, I know that a lot of us are based in Montreal, and thinking about the role of not only diaspora, so myself as a Haitian diaspora here, how do we participate in that, and how is it, how do we think about language as a being that migrates, right? And that part of being able to feed that being from its different satellite positions, but also that the role and responsibilities of allyship in that, and creating the framework for that to continue to thrive. So I want to say thank you. And I'm going to read that last question because I think it kind of asks a similar question around that. So this question is from Aaron S. And it says, as an educator, it seems evident to me that students learn best in their own language. However, I've seen a lot of school pushback to the idea in schools, whether from teachers and administrators or parents. How do you think we can address this in meaningful ways? What concrete steps can we take to change the narrative about language in education, not just within individual classrooms, but more on a global level? And I would expand that question to say in sectors as outside of also just education.
That's a great question, and that will give me a chance to mention this quite amazing project it started in Holland because of language discrimination there, because there were kids in Holland who would come to school, speak a different home language, and then the school would really put them in trauma by preventing them from using the home language and refusing to acknowledge the wealth of the home language. And so it's called the Language Friendly School. And then there you find lots of resources by teachers who are very aware of this sort of discrimination and who are pushing back, making sure that school systems can indeed honor the students' home languages, even in cases when the teachers themselves don't speak, because often there is this notion that, well, what if I don't speak the students' home language? How am I going to honor that home language in the school system? But there are actually very simple things that a teacher can do to allow the students to feel comfortable using or sharing the native language. It requires a certain humility to say, okay, maybe the teacher can, maybe the student can become a teacher as well. And it's a very empowering thing, for a student to feel that they can teach something about their home to the classmates and to the teacher. So I hope that, who asked the question?
It's Aaron. Aaron asked the question.
Yeah, so Aaron, yes. So take a look at this website for the language-friendly school organization. And I think there are quite a few resources. And also you can enter the network, and if you're part of the network, you get even more support from other schools that are really trying hard to honor the students' home languages.
Thank you so much. Merci en pile, Michel. Vraiment, présentation tellement spéciale, vraiment touché en pile. I just want to thank everyone for staying with us all this time. I know that we are far beyond the closing time that we had anticipated, but it is such an important topic. It is important that we create the space for these types of conversations. Michel, I think it will not be the last time that you are invited. We are going to be pulling you in again. I expect another invitation, and I'm just going to throw the ball to Charles to
yes, I see. Annick's hand has been raised for a bit.
Did you want to?
I don't want to take more time, but my question was also bouncing off of Marika's comment. I moved here 4 years ago, so I came here to study, and I was actually shocked to see how many Haitians there were here, first of all, and also how many Quebecers embraced Haitian culture as well, like not only in their slang. And the other day I did a presentation on your work, Dr. DeGraff, and in my class I had one of my classmates that he was a Quebecer, and he told me that I did a great presentation and that hopefully next time I can do it in Creole for him. Nice. And I asked him, did he speak Creole? And he's told me, yes, I speak a little bit, and then I'm learning it. He told me that in Creole.
Wow.
So yeah, so I just wanted to add that comment and also ask Annick if there were any classes on Haitian Creole or Haitian history here, because the Haitian community here is clearly a very large one. And also I feel like Quebec culture not only has, like the history of Quebec culture is very linked with Haitian culture as well. And also I feel like there should be a class and I would like to attend. So
maybe I can step in with that. Maybe you'll have something to add, Annick, but yeah, well, there's two Annicks, I'm getting confused. So Annick with one N. So if you remember, I teach in the linguistics program. And as Marika said, I don't know who told you that Haitian Creole is a real language. Maybe it was me, maybe it was one of my colleagues, but you'll hear it again and again in a linguistics course. So I'm sure Michel would recommend that you try maybe an introductory linguistics course to learn a little bit about these things. Or there's also a sociolinguistics course. The teacher is Jacqueline, who's here, and I'm sure you talk about Caribbean Creoles. So that's Linguistics 200, Linguistics 222, Linguistics 300. You can try any of those. And I don't know, Nick, do you have anything?
There is a history course in the history department. It isn't being taught at the moment. There's actually a push towards getting a Haitian professor to teach that in particular. And I would also just say that in this movement of addressing anti-Blackness in universities and understanding how systemic racism exists for our community, there is a task force on anti-Black racism, and that part of that work is to look at the curriculums, our faculty members, et cetera, and really create an action plan and resources in terms of making sure that we do have our knowledge is valued, centered, in the ways that they really need to be, because especially as a reflection of this particular world, you are very right that the many people have written about the interesting links between Haitian community and Quebec communities, which is also full of tension, right? Full of collaboration, tension. It is complex. It is within itself a site to research itself, and so there is definitely more work towards that. And though at the moment there is not an official Haitian language course, but there is push around looking at what a Black Studies program would look at Concordia, and that is, language in any of our kind of culture-specific programs. Language always becomes very important. So.
Okay. Amazing. Thank you so much. Go ahead, Michel.
Yeah, I think the point you made, Annick, is Anik with one N, is crucial about, because once you introduce Haitian Creole in that space, automatically it gives it capital. You see, because like in Haiti now, it's because I'm a lot on social media, on Instagram and Facebook and Twitter. And often when young Haitians who are very much in favor of pushing Creole in those official spaces like school system, the ministries, etc., they say, well, look, why can Creole be used at MIT? Why can Creole be used at Duke University? Why can Creole be used at FIU and other universities and not in Haiti? Why is that? There's a problem. You see, so they use that as a status symbol. The fact that Creole is included in programs at various universities in the US and in Europe and Canada, that gives it more value. I mean, think of it this way. Think of how many Romance languages departments do we have in the US? How many French departments? How many Spanish teaching units? So I think it reflects something also about, in fact, there's a wonderful volume that was published by Donaldo Macedo about the teaching of English as a second language. And there he looks at the structure of these language teaching departments. And basically those departments, they often reflect the history of white supremacy. Why is it that in all these universities, you tend to have departments that teach Germanic languages, Romance languages, but very often it's fine between departments that teach African languages or Caribbean Creoles. So it's definitely one way to concretely give capital to these languages that have been stigmatized.
Yes, I agree 100%. Anyways, I just wanted to say thank you and also just mention that I work with Decolonizing Light. It's a project on deconstructing colonialism in STEM mostly. And I'm doing research and I would love to connect with you, Anik, and everyone in your organization. I'm not in linguistics, but I'm very interested. Anyways, thank you so much.
Okay. So you can contact us and we'll hook you up with some good materials. So Anik, are we ready? I think let's have one more round of applause. And thank you very much, Michel. Michel, I'm going to get in touch with you tomorrow so we can